Welcome to the Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. Originating in India, yoga is an ancient somatic practice with roots in Hinduism. This methodology of mindful movement and sustained postures, called asanas, is meant to connect our physical, mental, and spiritual nature through the body. Today, yoga is commonplace around the world, with enthusiasts embedding it within their workout regimen. Bridging the fitness and noetic benefits of yoga for women is certified holistic yoga therapist Naya Bajaj. Based in Toronto, Naya's practice focuses on helping women improve their self-image and harness their personal power through adversity at all stages of life, from burnout to menopause. It's a pleasure to welcome to the show, Naya Bajaj. Hello, Naya. Why don't we start with the most basic question? What is holistic yoga therapy?
Holistic yoga therapy is a whole person approach. So we look across all 8 aspects of well-being and use tools from the practice of yoga beyond asana. So asana could be part of the solution, but we look at values, we look at philosophy, we look very deeply at nervous system regulation or restoration, depending on where someone is at. There may also be formal seated meditation or visualization practices that we integrate, really to support the student who is arriving in the moment that they are arriving. So what is the sort of cause of suffering that we examine, but also what is the immediate experience of suffering that we are looking to resolve? So to make that more concrete, because that sounds very, airy-fairy and philosophical, I had a student who showed up recently with shoulder pain. She came to me because her shoulder was hurting. There was some mobility restriction. And in conversation with her, we came to realize that a lot of her shoulder tension was coming from the fact that she spent a lot of time sort of curled forward at her desk. So there's a postural piece that, we could ergonomically address as well, in addition to, basic mobility practices tied with breath to relieve the immediate pain. But then it was the ergonomics, and then it was, why are you always curled forward? Maybe your job's not actually that fulfilling, or you're feeling really tense about the toxic work environment that you're in. And maybe that is something to explore as a longer term solution to this immediate problem that you're facing, so that, in 6 weeks or 6 months, she's not coming back to me with the same shoulder pain. So immediate solutions, and then also a view to, what are the root causes of this suffering and how do we address that together?
So there is a talk therapy element to it, correct?
Yes, but not in the way that sort of Western models of talk therapy exist. So it's not like, oh, you come in and I'm gonna be like, oh, yes, it's probably CBT or DBT or one of those things. It is very much a human conversation and an understanding of someone's lived experience of suffering as opposed to my imagined experience of, their real-time existence, and very much guided by the human sitting in front of me, as opposed to, I have this standard set of tools and we're going to one size fits all it and stick you in this box and hope it works out.
I was reading that you incorporate Ayurvedic principles as well as narrative medicine. I'm wondering whether you could talk about those two areas.
Absolutely. So Ayurveda is the sister science to yoga, where yoga is about breath and movement and nervous system regulation from a very somatic perspective. Ayurveda sort of addresses all of the lifestyle components, as it were. So we may look at diet, but we also might look at skincare. So it really is about how you nourish yourself. And then yoga is about how you use that energy to live really, really well. And so, from an Ayurvedic perspective, conversations we might have are about things like constitutional type, which, similar to traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda holds that we are all made up of 5 elements in different proportionalities. And so, how do we balance those out? The tradition holds that you are sort of born with one elemental constitution, and then over the course of your lifespan, that might shift. And that shift can be what causes discomfort or manifests as disease. And so, how do we use tools like diet, but also tools in your environment to help return you to that original constitution, which is where you feel best? Which can be a really fun set of problems to solve if folks are open to working in that way, but it does not have to be integrated if folks aren't ready for it. And then the other side is the narrative medicine side, which really is using the practice of narrative competence to puzzle out your own relationship to your story, but also your relationship to other people's stories, because we don't exist in a vacuum. And so, narrative competence is the capacity to, I like to think of it as being mindful about story, but really to sort of, when you are sitting with someone and they're telling you a story, whether formally or just informally in conversation, to observe your physiological response. So as you're listening, does your breath change? Does your heart rate change? Does your jaw get tight? Do your shoulders climb up around your ears? Which we often tune out of. We're not encouraged to be in the body in many cultures. And so to observe that response, and then to observe the corresponding emotional response. So is my jaw tight because I really want to share a story too, and I'm biting my tongue because I'm hoping this person will finish, or is my jaw tight because that was really stressful to hear and I've had a similar experience and I'm quietly reliving that in my head and not fully listening to that human? So to observe those 2 things in yourself, but then also to observe the nonverbal communication of the storyteller. Someone may, verbally be very light in tone about a story, but you can see in their face or you can see in their posture that it's actually really hard for them to talk about. And to sort of take that information, take the cognitive information that you're getting from the story, and understand what action they are motivating you toward. And then to decide, using that information and the information you have about yourself, whether that action is values aligned or if you'd like to do something different. And this sounds super complicated, right? When I break it down into these component parts, this sounds like a very difficult thing to do, but we do it all the time without thinking about it. And so, really, the practice is to sort of deliberately tune in to that. And often my students will use this, we'll use it in our conversations, but then they might take that into a conversation with a care provider. So, if they're talking to their GP about a symptom, so my student with the shoulder pain, as an example, if she went to her GP and said, "Oh yeah, my shoulder hurts, and I'd really like something to solve that," and if she's hoping for a non-pharmacological solution, but her doctor is, instead of referring her to a physical therapist, says, "Oh, just take these pills," to observe how attentive that physician is, what's going on perhaps in their communication, both verbal and nonverbal, and then to decide if she wants to challenge that, to say, I'd prefer not to do that. I'd like to see a physiotherapist, if that physician would be open to hearing it. And so it just helps negotiate the conversations in a meaningful way and confirm whether or not care providers are hearing my students. So then they can decide what story they really want to tell.
That's really interesting. I had never heard of narrative medicine before you talking about it. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on the common humanity component of mindful self compassion. And it feels very relevant to that. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Narrative medicine it's often a community practice. So the example I shared is sort of very one-on-one, but often I will do this practice with groups of individuals who share a lived experience. So it could be heart disease, it could be caregiving for aging parents, whatever the case is. We come together and we experience a piece of narrative. It might be a chunk of a memoir, it might be a piece of film, it might be a piece of music or a piece of visual art about that experience. And then we use it as a jumping off point to tell our own stories, which can be a really powerful way to find language for things that people don't have language for or were never given language for. Shoulder pain, maybe not a great example in this instance, but for folks who are living with diabetes, as an example, to hear the lived experience of someone else who has been through similar suffering and then to leverage that. And for a lot of my students, experiencing narrative about their experience gives them a way in that is a little bit more gentle and a little bit kinder to a story that they might have very much come at from that like second arrow level of suffering where there is the immediate, physical discomfort or physiological discomfort, and then there's the story we tell about it that can make that suffering that much worse. And so to maybe not remove that second tier, but to come at it from a place of a little bit more gentleness, a little bit more kindness. My colleagues who work in sort of more Western medical models like to say, oh, if you were to treat yourself the way you would treat your best friend or the way you would treat someone you really care about, finding narrative from someone else who is similarly suffering can sometimes create that distance that allows for that kindness and allows for that gentleness, which I find really compelling.
Earlier, you were talking about the five elements of Ayurvedic medicine,
Yeah.
and I believe they're called koshas. And I'm wondering whether you could talk about the koshas.
The five elements are literally earth, water, fire, space, and air, which are air and space are two different things. And so it is the combination of those things that make up all material objects that we perceive. The koshas are layers of being that exist both in the Ayurvedic space and in the yogic space. And so your physical, literal physical self is one layer of being. Your physiological self. So when we think about lymphatic movement, circulation, digestive fluids moving, that is your physiological being. There's an energetic being, which as Western medicine sort of starts to grapple with fascia and what it does, traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and yoga have always held that there is an energetic self. And, as both acupuncture and marma therapy and Ayurveda hold that energy runs through channels in the body. We're starting to realize from a Western context that is just what fascia is doing, moving energy through the body by enfolding all of the parts of the body. And so there's your energetic being, there is your personal psychological being, so the mind state, which is not the same as the sort of more universal consciousness that we believe dwells within each human, which is sort of, small part of and deeply connected to the larger universal consciousness. And so as we move through each of these states of being, we achieve greater and greater ease in ourselves. But from a yoga therapy perspective, as I'm working with a human, sometimes the question is, where is this suffering actually rooted? What layer of being is it showing up in? Is it purely a physical problem that we can relieve with movement? If it is physiological, maybe there's a breath component to help regulate the nervous system. If it's an energetic situation, maybe there is a food component. Maybe there are other things and other modalities we need to bring into play. So acupuncture can be really powerful in sort of moving those energy blocks. We use oil, and self-oil application is another way of sort of shifting energy, which if you think about nerve conduction and the fact that nerves are covered in a layer of fat can be a really interesting thing to explore. Sorry, I get very nerdy about this also from a physiological perspective. And so it's interesting to think about those symptoms, but sometimes it is a psychological issue, in which case we have a different set of tools. And then we sort of explore what level of meditation is appropriate or what might not be helpful for a human. And then sometimes, and this is that sort of fifth layer of being, and this is where I remember asking my teachers, I was, sometimes we have very, very young humans who are showing up with really terrible terminal illnesses. How do you grapple with that as a care provider? How do you sit with that? And, if the idea that suffering is, epigenetic, comes from many, many layers, many generations of work, how do you hold that reality? And for them, what I was taught was that sometimes it's not that individual human life. It is, something that they're bringing forward. There is a lesson that they are here to teach others. And so, yes, there is a lot of suffering at a very young point in someone's life, but it might not be their work to do. They might be there to support the work of other humans as part of that universal consciousness, which can make it easier as a care provider to sort of hold that level of suffering. Especially, I don't work with kids with terminal illness, but I have colleagues who do. And so that is a framework that they bring into their own understanding to enable them to be really present with that human as opposed to be overwhelmed by the idea that someone so young is not going to be with us for very much longer.
You mentioned that you had issues with body image as a child, which developed into an eating disorder. I wonder if you can share a little bit about your story.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know that it's a terribly unique story as, a female-bodied person who grew up in the 90s. I think we all had this experience of existing in a very, very pervasive kind of diet culture. And as sort of my generation has become the one that our things are now vintage, I'm starting to see a lot of media comparison between, what we were told was fat, but really was undernourished across popular media, particularly in terms of women's bodies. And so I should say, as a little human, I also lived with a lot of chronic pain. It's actually why I came to a yoga practice as a way of managing that pain and making it through the day. But that chronic pain across all of my joints meant I didn't move very much as a young person. And I love food. We come from a family of restaurateurs, and so food is always really present, which is really fun, but also meant I was a fat kid. And children are not very kind to each other sometimes. And so there was a lot of sort of social commentary. I'm also of South Asian heritage, and it's quite common in our culture to sort of comment on people's bodies like they are public property. And so there was also a lot of sort of that narrative in my head from parents and caregivers and other humans. And, well-meaning enough. No one came at it with a harmful intention, but it is very easy as a young person to sort of ingest that value judgment about, the fact that your body is the first thing that people see about you, and they form impressions based on that. And I internalized a lot of it. And so as I got better at managing the physical pain, then it became sort of, if I can manage this about my body, what else can I manage about my body as a young person who doesn't have a lot of control or agency elsewhere in my life? And food became a thing that was very, very easy to control in situations where I otherwise didn't feel like I had very much control. And so for my teens, most of my 20s, I lived with a pretty severe eating disorder, not so severe as to be hospitalized, but also in a culture where many, many young women were restricting what they were eating. So no one thought it was abnormal to sort of, skip meals for most of the day, to eat once a day. And then as I sort of moved out of the restaurant space and into the corporate world, movement became more important to me. So it went from being sort of more of an anorectic set of tendencies to an orthorexic set of tendencies, where then I would only eat things if they were super healthy or super clean. I would only eat food that I prepared for myself, which changed how I engaged with people. And I grappled with that for a while until eventually the pain conditions just came back. And I realized that I could not do all of the things I wanted to do in this life in a very undernourished body. And so I have an excellent care team now that takes very good care of me. But a big part of my ongoing recovery is being attentive to where it feels like I am losing control of situations and where food suddenly seems like the one thing that I can still make active decisions about.
Can you share a little bit more about the chronic pain that you experienced? What is it and how do you manage it?
Yeah, for sure. So neurological pain conditions run in my family. It's not novel to me. Women in my family, particularly, I think on both sides, though we don't have conclusive medical documentation for my paternal grandmother, but my maternal grandmother lived with migraines her whole life. My mom does, my aunt does, my sister does. In my case, it's less migraine and more chronic joint pain across all of my joints. And when I was a younger human, sort of when I did complain about it, physicians would just say, oh, well, they're just growing pains. I'm 5'4". I stopped growing a long time ago and I did not get very tall. So I don't buy the whole, it's just growing pains. But I remember being, 5 or 6 and waking up in the middle of the night in so much pain that I ended up sort of tying socks around all of my joints to stabilize them enough so that I could go back to sleep. And as a teenager, I would also, I mean, socks were no longer an option, but I remember sort of being up for 2 or 3 nights in a row, running a scalding bath like every hour on the hour and just sitting in it until it cooled, getting out, rerunning that bath, and using heat as a way of sort of topically managing the pain experience. But I was so exhausted, I wasn't able to sort of pay any attention at school. And so I did that for a long time as a young person and eventually sort of came to a place of learning breath regulation techniques as a way to internally manage that pain because over the course of the school day it's not like I could leave and go run a bath. And so using breath as a way of regulating. And then I've told the story a lot and it's still a little funny to me every time I tell it. But my dad noticed that I was struggling and he said, "Oh, you should go to a yoga class. Like it will help manage the anxiety that you're generally feeling about life and sort of, the control issues that you have, but also, you'll get some movement in." And he signed me up for a seniors yoga class. I was 13. And I don't know if he did this deliberately or he just like wasn't paying attention. And so I got to this community center in the suburb that we were living in, and I walk in the door and I'm like, one of these things is not like the others. And the yoga teacher was very kind. She said, "Well, you're on my list. So if you want to stay, you can stay." And I didn't have any way to get home until, my dad was coming to pick me up after the class. So I figured, fine, I'll take this class. And it was incredible to sort of be on the mat, to start to come home to a body that had never felt like home before, to feel a little bit of safety in that experience. And as I was looking around at, all of these like septuagenarians and octogenarians who seemed to be so connected with themselves, I was just like, oh, I want that for me one day. Maybe not today, but if I keep doing this, I think one day I will be like them. And it was very hopeful and very inspiring to find that. And so I stuck with the practice.
You mentioned breath, you mentioned yoga, and earlier you mentioned diet. So, can we talk about how those three components helped to manage your chronic pain?
Yeah, absolutely. Breath is still my primary tool for pain management, and it functions in a couple of ways. One is like back of brain awareness of breath, which is a cultivated skill. It wasn't something I was able to do immediately. It's where sort of a good mindfulness practice can be really useful. And it serves me now and served me when I learned to do this to notice where my breath was getting shorter, sharper, faster. Because for me, that is the first sign that I want to exercise some agency in this space and shift something about it that will bring my breath back to that long, slow, smooth, soft, regulated experience. Because if I don't act then, the next phase for me is usually some sort of muscle tension in a joint area that feels unstable. I'm a very hypermobile person, and so all of my joints sort of feel very unstable a lot of the time. They don't function the way they should because of connective tissue not being functional, essentially. So my jaw is really loose, my shoulders are very mobile. And if I don't address whatever in the situation, whether that's interpersonal interaction or I'm carrying too much weight or I'm carrying my purse on the wrong side, all of those things can be factors. But if I don't address the thing that's changing my breath, it will manifest as muscle tension. And that tension will then compress nerves and will result in pain that then requires more intervention than is helpful. And that might be pharmacological intervention. It might be I need to take 3 hours off and go sit in a sauna, or I need to have a massage therapist come in and physically release the tissue to release the nerve compression. And so all of those things are more resource heavy than usually I want to engage with. So if I can address the thing in the situation, so whether that's, an angry email from my boss, maybe we just have a conversation and be like, I perceive the tone of your email this way. Am I correct in my perception? Because I might not be. But if I am, can we talk about how to communicate so that this doesn't happen again? Because this has downstream impacts for me. So breath is super useful as a predictor and as a management tool, but then also as an active intervention. And yoga has many, many different practices of breathing. And I'm very fortunate to have learned many of them with excellent teachers and to be able to sort of self-diagnose to a degree. And so I can predict, what the downstream effect will be. I can then leverage a breath technique to manage it. So it may be, really regulated breathing. I may leverage a breath technique to boost my energy as an example. Or if I think I'm going to go into a situation that's going to make me anxious, I might choose sort of a slower, more focused breath technique to dial down that response so that if it does happen, it's not as extreme as it could have been. And so breath serves many, many functions in my day. The other piece, diet for someone who has not eaten well for a long, long time is a really important factor, particularly in terms of micronutrients, less so the macros. So also important to get all of those as I get older. Both heart health and bone health are really big considerations. And as a perimenopausal person, menopause has major impacts on both of those systems. So those are things that I'm working with my team on to ensure that, I don't fall and break my hip, because recovery from that for someone who did not nourish her bones for the time that she was supposed to is going to have some pretty dramatic impacts. But for me, a lot of it is, making sure iron levels are where they need to be, because that has a direct impact on my energy, which also has a direct impact on my experience with burnout. That's why my last burnout recovery cycle took so long, because my ferritin levels were non-existent. And so we've been exploring ways to bring that back up, because that changes my ability to be comfortable in this body and to function well. And so a whole bunch of amazing humans were taking good care of me in that space, and also a lot of Ayurvedic practice, because Ayurveda is also very much about supporting your digestion so that you can access energy from the things that you are eating. And so basic principles, warm cooked food is easier to digest than cold food. So smoothies are not on my list of things. I would sooner eat a soup than a salad kind of situation. But it's making those informed choices so that I can access the nutrition that I need and ensure that this body continues to function as well as it can, and I can be safe and comfortable with it. When I think about yoga, I think about all 8 limbs of the practice. Most people think about asana, they think about movement, which is great and not always accessible. So depending on sort of what my pain level is on any given day, movement, I might not be able to get out of bed. In which case I might visualize doing a movement practice, because there's lots of great studies that indicate that visualizing movement can be just as powerful from a neurological perspective as actual movement. So they had, I think the original study, they had piano players visualize practicing piano versus practicing piano, and they found that both of them achieved the same level of competency, even though half the group wasn't actually hitting the keys, which makes me feel really hopeful on days where I'm like, I cannot get on the floor today, but I can visualize, transitioning from child's pose to a tabletop to a downward dog. I can have the felt experience because I know the felt experience from my practice. And so part of it is the guided visualization. As someone who has struggled with sleep for a big chunk of my life, the practice of yoga nidra, which is supported sleep. So it's not sleep in that like deep REM state sleep, but it allows for a level of rest physiologically and psychologically that is very, very lovely and restorative. So on days that I'm struggling with sleep, that might be my practice. It usually puts me to sleep too, which is really fun. But I also think about it in terms of the yamas and the niyamas, which are our ethical guidelines or values aligned guidelines. And one set really guides your relationship with yourself. The other set guides your relationship with all of the beings around you, both living and non-living. And these are concepts that people will likely have heard of, the concept of ahimsa or non-harming. What does that look like for yourself? And as someone who lives with an eating disorder, that's an active consideration. Will this choice actually harm me, or is this helpful? But also practices on the flip side, like santosha, which is the practice of contentedness. And what does it mean to be content in this moment as it is happening, as opposed to wanting to change something about it that may or may not be in my locus of control? And so the core of the practice for me really are those principles, because everything flows from that. What my asana practice looks like is determined by those principles. What I'm eating is determined by those principles. How I show up in conversation is determined by those. And so for me, it starts there, and then all of the other pieces fall into place.
You mentioned earlier that you worked in the corporate world. So, what was the catalyst that moved you from corporate, from the office, to your practice?
I will say I still work in the corporate world. I wear both hats, which in some cases contributes to my burnout, but I'm finding a more sustainable balance. And for me, the transition between the two, or sort of the reason I do both, is because my corporate work has been in public service, which is deeply meaningful, super values aligned. And I chose that career path because when I was sort of thinking about the world as a young person, I was like, where are the levers to address the largest amount of suffering? And for many people, it is the systems and structures that are run by governments. It is your access to transportation, it is your access to safe housing, it is your, in some cases, access to safe food and water. And in many, many places in the world, it is governments who make those decisions and set those policies and run those systems. And so I figured if I could get in on the end of the people building those systems, I have the chance to relieve suffering for potentially hundreds of thousands of people. That said, government takes a long time. And so, while it is very lovely and idealistic to feel like one day I will relieve suffering for hundreds of thousands of people, it's probably going to take my whole career to do some of those things because government moves slowly. And there's a reason for that. But I'm not a very patient person. And so 5 or 6 years ago, I got really frustrated because, I show up to my office, I send maybe 75 emails. I don't think I made a difference in anyone's life beyond cluttering someone's inbox. And that got to be a little bit sad as someone who, wants to have tangible impact in the world. And so I trained to become a therapist because when I see someone in my practice at the end of the session, I know I have made at least a small positive difference in their lives. And so for me, it helps balance the frustration of sort of a long career trying to do something that will impact many, many humans and the lack of fulfillment that I feel some days to then be like, oh, but I helped one person today. I relieved some measure of suffering for one human. And so this day was not a complete write off versus all I did today was send emails. Oh, well, I didn't do anything real for anyone.
Earlier, you talked about the challenges that you personally had with eating, with chronic pain, and you also mentioned burnout. So, where does burnout fit into this whole picture, not only for yourself, but just from a wider lens?
This is a great question. I've been thinking about burnout a little bit differently recently because I feel like post pandemic burnout became like the conversation to have. Everyone was talking about it, everyone had a symptoms list, everyone knew their profile. And in the last, I want to say 6 months, I've been thinking about burnout less as an individual problem and more as a systems level issue, particularly for sort of female bodied people, people in caregiving roles, where the systems are not designed to be sustainable. They're designed to extract as many resources as they can from the humans that are in them and to sort of, chew them up, spit them out. Someone else will come and do this work, which is true, I think, for many of our systems. They're designed to be extractive, they're not designed to be sustainable. And as someone who burns out once a decade or so, that is a systemic issue that I would like to sort of empower people to grapple with in a meaningful way, because I am the kind of person who will like throw herself fully into something if I think it is meaningful. And most of the work I do is very, very values aligned. So it feels very easy to keep devoting resources to something that is going to positively impact people, even if the cost is my own well being. But I've realized as I get older that recovery takes longer and longer. So, the first time I burnt out in my 20s was maybe 6 months to bounce back. And then the second time in my, late 20s, very early 30s was maybe a year. The last time I burnt out, it took me 2 years to come back. And that's too long, in my opinion, to be kept from doing really valuable, meaningful work. And so my sort of own awareness to sort of observe a system and to think about if I'm really going to pour all of my resources into this, how I'm going to give back to me so that I can keep doing this work in a really meaningful way. In the workplace, is the culture supportive of rest? Do we take breaks? Do we take good care of each other? If I see another colleague doing this, am I empowered to gently call them into a conversation and ask, you know, are there other supports we can put into place so that collectively we can move this work forward? In my own practice, is there enough nourishment? Is there enough rest? Am I finding enough joy? Is there awe in the natural world? Or have I been trapped in this tiny office for weeks on end trying to get a thing done because the thing feels really important, but I won't be able to enjoy it by the time it comes to fruition? And so I've been thinking about those big questions because systems are not set up for us to succeed, especially if there are certain identity markers at play. And as I do this work for myself, I can then support other humans in reclaiming their own agency in those systems as well, because that's how they'll change.
You talk about the extractive nature of systems, and you talk about that experience in the workplace, but also in your personal practice as well, and safeguards that you can put in place. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So, what is the answer to preventing burnout?
That's a great question. I think the answer will vary person to person, but at its core, it comes down to those values aligned boundaries, which I don't know that anyone is really taught to set those unless you've had someone sort of model them for you, especially if you're a young person and you watched sort of an older person do that. I know it didn't exist in my household. People are just sort of, we go all in on the things we care about. We hope it works out and we hope someone will catch us when we crumble. Not sustainable. And so it really is, if my values are about, being well enough to take good care of other people, then I need to set some time boundaries around how much I'm willing to pour into this, either corporate work or even my own therapy practice so that I have adequate time for rest. I can go and maintain strong social connections with my community. I can go and find active awe in nature because without those things, I'm a very depleted human and I cannot show up and take good care of the people around me. So part of it is that self-awareness of what are the things that are non-negotiable to keep you well and well in a way that feels really fulfilling, not well in the way that I can continue to function in this extractive environment. Well is joyful, well is socially connected, well is well nourished. And then to set those hard boundaries. So, there are days where I'm like, I have an out of office set. I'm not checking email today. If this is an emergency, pick up the phone, give me a call. No one ever calls. I'm not indispensable. And so to carve out that time so then I can go and see my massage therapist. I can, make sure I take my mom to the dentist. I can do all of those other things that manage the structures around me and keep those well functioning. So awareness, but then also the willingness to stand up for those boundaries and to recognize which ones are porous and which ones are not. And so, where is there some flexibility? We have some very demanding clients on the team that I work for. And so if, there is a very serious client demand, then sure, there is a little bit of flexibility. I will check email after hours if I know we have a deadline that we're working to. I'm not just going to check email after hours in the hopes that something will come in. So that's a really slippery slope for me. And I know that because then it's, midnight and I'm still working on a thing that no one really asked for. But if I get it off my plate now, I don't have to do it tomorrow. And tomorrow there will be more work anyway because public service never ends. But if I start to do that, then I never stop. And so there is a hard time boundary there that, if there is an actual emergency, sure, we'll flex. But otherwise, no, that's fine. You get, you pay me for X number of hours, you get X number of hours, and that's our contractual agreement. And I don't feel bad about that. So the other part of it is also the awareness of the emotional fallout, which can be really hard to sit with if you are someone who, whose identity is wrapped in people need me, or I'm really good at this, and this is what generates my value, as opposed to I'm inherently valuable because I am here. And learning to shift that internal dialogue can also help maintain those values aligned boundaries, which then keeps people well and will shift systems over time.
What inspired you to start your practice?
So, a lot of I don't even know if it was inspiration so much as it was a desire to give back. As someone who's, obviously lived with various levels of physical suffering and The Western medical model, while like very lovely and very useful for what it's designed to do, which is look at parts of a human and treat those parts as though they are separate from each other, didn't serve me very well because my issues are system level issues. And I don't mean systems like banks and libraries and institutions. I literally mean connective tissue, um, which is a systemic condition. Same with nerve pain. But people are like, oh, your shoulder hurts or your hip hurts. You know, we should look at those individual parts of you. And so the Western model didn't serve me very, very well. And most of the relief that I have received has come from practices in the yogic tradition. And I know I'm not the only person suffering like this. And so as I found relief and regained capacity, the desire to relieve similar suffering in similar humans was the largest motivating factor because I know how debilitating it is to be in that space. And the fact that these very accessible, often very low cost tools have significantly improved my quality of life. It was more, how do I make this accessible for as many humans as possible so then we can regain our capacity and go out and change the world in the ways that we are meant to change it.
When did you start your practice?
My therapy practice or my yoga practice?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's like those
Why
are
don't
two
we
different things.
let's explore both?
Um, so I would venture, because I am of South Asian heritage, sort of yoga and Ayurveda have been integrated into my life since the very beginning. So Ayurvedic practice, shows up in our kitchen on a daily basis. Like I was drinking turmeric milk when I was sick, well before they became fancy $12 lattes. Right? This is just part of what we do. And so that never felt like something I had to learn. It was just how I was raised. And in the yoga practice, it wasn't, my first practice was not an asana practice. That's not how I came to the tradition. My grandfather, my mom's dad, used to teach classes on the Bhagavad Gita. So once a week, people would come to our house and literally sit at his feet and listen to teachings and learn how to apply these like very fancy philosophical concepts into their day-to-day lives. And I was, 5 or 6 and running around and wandering in and out of these conversations. And so sort of imbibed them as a 6-year-old does and sort of made sense of them in my own way. And then, as I was more formally trained, I was like, oh, I remember all of this. I used to chant with my grandmother, which is a really powerful tool for breath regulation. No one taught it to me as, breath regulation. She was just like, come sit and do this thing that I do because it serves me well. I can't tell you why, but it's part of our heritage. So just do it. And so the practice has always been part of my life. And then additional pieces have come in as it's made sense for them to come in. My therapy practice was founded just as the pandemic was wrapping up. So I did my training over the pandemic, which was kind of hilarious to sort of learn how to take a very body-based practice into a purely virtual environment. Didn't plan on it, started the training before, did all of the in-class stuff, learned how to take people's pulse and, do a tongue analysis and all these things that you do sitting in front of someone to gauge their energy. And as soon as I was ready to start my internship, the world locked down. And so then I had to puzzle out how to translate these in-person skills to a purely virtual environment, which was fascinating. Because now it was like, oh, do you have a Fitbit? Will it tell me what's happening? Or, trying to puzzle out how to work with people in their homes as opposed to in my practice space where can you set up a camera far enough away? Because right now all I can see is your ear and your elbow, and I don't know if the practice is working because I can't see you. So it was really fun puzzling that out, but also figuring out how to make the practice accessible for folks who were immune compromised, folks who didn't feel safe leaving their homes, and how to sort of come to a place of co-regulation through a screen, which was, I think, a really valuable set of skills to be forced to learn. I don't know that a lot of my colleagues who didn't train in that period of time were set up to learn those things. And so it's made my practice globally accessible, which I love, though I don't know that I loved it while I was doing the learning.
So your holistic yoga therapy practice focuses on women, and I'm wondering whether you can tell us why.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this understanding in the yoga space, maybe not the yoga space broadly, but at least the yoga therapy space, that when you're looking to sit with a teacher, you have sort of two options of who you sit with. You can sit with a guru, and Western media has perverted this term, but the understanding is the guru is someone who has sort of learned the theory, who has sat with a teacher who has studied the text, who understands the mechanics of something. Or you can study or learn from or work with what the word is acharya. And an acharya is someone who has lived experience of a condition. So, whatever the suffering is, they have had that suffering, they have been through the journey, they've made it out the other side. And you can choose to work with, either of those groups of learners. Both of them will be helpful. But when we were talking about, as therapists, if we're called specialized, what should we do? And my teacher's advice was, why not be that acharya for someone? Why not be the person who has gotten to, the end of the journey, as it were, and can look back and offer helpful tools? And so I work with women because I don't have lived experience in a male body. I don't know what it is like. Can I talk to you intelligently about the theory? 100%. But I will only ever be a guru in that space. I cannot bring to you the lived experience that someone who has walked in that body can bring. I'm still pretty smart. I still have lots of tools in the toolbox. So can I help you? Yes. Would you be better helped by someone who has had that lived experience and also has all the tools in the toolbox and knows all the practices? I think so. So I will not turn anyone away. That is not the nature of my practice. But I am especially well equipped to support female bodied people who are living with eating disorder or in recovery from it, who have a lived experience of chronic pain, who are hypermobile, who, are perimenopausal now that I'm in that space, because I can speak not only from I have lived through this and I can not only empathize, but practice a level of compassion that I think goes deeper than my sort of very technical understanding of this other thing. And so that's why I work with the humans that I work with. I will not turn anyone away. So if there are male listeners who are like, she sounds awesome, I want to come work with her, please do. But I don't have the same degree of understanding of your lived experience. Stories will help us get there. It's why I have a strong narrative medicine practice. It's why that's such a critical part. But women like to work with me because I can fully understand what it is like.
Earlier, you were talking about your experience as a woman growing up in the 90s. I'm wondering whether you have a sense of whether things have shifted since then.
So things did shift and now they're going back the other way. There was a period, I want to say even 5 years ago, where, and this is like, a lot of this has to do with geopolitics, a lot of this has to do with global power structures, and this larger conversation about who gets to hold power, who gets to make decisions about people's bodies, and what the narrative about the value of a woman being in a small body, what that does. And so for a while, we had lots of body positivity. There was lots of celebration of diverse bodies. We saw that in popular media, and it was great. Women everywhere were like, oh, I don't have to be a size zero. I can go and lift really heavy weights. I can accomplish all of these things. And as I want to say, the world has become more conservative politically, there is a strong push back towards the kind of bodies that were prized when I was a young person. It used to be the Kate Moss heroin chic kind of thing, and now it's all the trad wives who are teeny, teeny, tiny, and having babies and going back to being size zeros. And fundamentally, that makes for a less strong human, because your body is naturally that much smaller because of all of the things that you were depriving it of, which means, yeah, you can't lift heavy things, but it also changes your cognitive capacity in a very tangible way. Brains are made up of fat. You tell women to stop eating fat. Not only does that impact their nerves, it directly impacts their brains and it impacts their health in the long term. And so this push to, oh, someone was telling me yesterday about women going to plastic surgery asking for yoga boobs. I don't know if you've seen this or like this has shown up in your space, but it's this idea that like the ideal yoga body is very small and very flat and very prepubescent looking. And now this is a surgical procedure that people are requesting in an effort, as women are requesting, not people. Men are not requesting the surgery. Women are requesting this procedure to be smaller because that is what the culture is telling them is valuable. And it's so concerning to me because I know what it is like for women of my generation who are still actively trying to recover their health in some ways, to now have another generation of young women, our daughters. I don't have daughters, I don't have children, but my friends' daughters are now living with the same garbage that I lived with. And I'm very concerned about what this is going to do to their well-being.
You were talking just now about the regressive aspects of society and how that is shifting the progress that we've had over so many years in creating a more inclusive, accepting space for women, an equitable space for women, one that is based on respect. And I'm wondering whether you can share, based on your experience as a therapist, but also in your own observation, about what you see as the core issues women are facing today.
Oh man, there are so many issues. But I think, like, at its very fundamental level, I think women are grappling with the fact that we have more access to economic power because, many of us now are highly educated, are employed, whether, most of us outside the home, some of us also sort of within the home. And that access to power destabilizes traditional relationship models. And those are our relationships with ourselves, but also our relationships with all of the people around us. And no one has really taught anyone how to sort of move through this brave new world, as it were. A lot of women that I know are still, apprehensive, like what they do with all this economic capital that they now have access to that grants them a level of power. But they're not investing it, which is terrifying to me because if your money is not making money, what's it doing for you? But also that will limit your ability to access power at other levels in the same way that like the men in many women's lives are not encouraging them to do that. And I'm always curious about why and how much of that is a way of maintaining relational power. And I hear this from a lot of women. Oh, my husband is handling our investments. Cool. What happens, when he's no longer around for whatever reason? It's your money too. But also the fear of, I don't want to out earn my husband, that, he will feel emasculated. And of course, there's a whole crisis of masculinity happening that I don't know that we have time to get into today. But that impacts how humans are engaging with each other. And I see this in young people too, right? Young men and boys, and how they increasingly are encouraged not to see women as people, but as objects to possess, to do whatever with. And that fundamental sort of choice not to engage with them as humans. It's not new. Like this has always been the case in some cultures and is increasingly becoming the case in global culture. But the harm that does to women's bodies, to their mental well-being. Right? I just today saw a study where they were like, oh yeah, we did a completely anonymous study of men, and 98% of them, because the study was completely anonymous, confirmed that at least one point in their lives they have engaged in sexually coercive tactics. So I was like 98%. And so for half the population, and like female bodied people, female assigned at birth, but anyone who is holding an identity that is not, entirely masculine, to fundamentally feel that unsafe for your whole life is a massive issue. It shows up in the nervous system, it shows up physically, it shows up psychologically, it changes how people make decisions, it changes how our world works. It has always been the case, but it is now so much the case and so publicly the case that I think it's impacting people even more. Like it used to be that like it was, we knew, but we didn't talk about it. But now we're talking about it and nothing seems to be changing, which I think changes how women access hope. Because it's one thing to be like, oh, maybe it'll be better for someone else. Maybe it's just my shitty experience, but someone else will not have to suffer this. And now we know that almost all of us are. And short of our self-advocacy and our individual protections and our community protection of each other, systems and structures don't seem to be interested in helping or protecting us. And I think that fundamentally creates a lot of internalized misogyny. There's a lot of terrible things that happen to people psychologically when you exist in systems like this that shows up in physical health, in mental health, in community health.
I mean, this might seem obvious, but I'm going to ask the question because I want your perspective. How can men be better allies to women?
like at its core, treat us like human beings and not like objects. Which, if you've never been taught that, find someone who can teach you that, which is hard because it requires a level of self-awareness that can be really uncomfortable. Like I cannot imagine if I was a male-bodied person and listening to the words that are coming out of my mouth right now, I'd be like, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. That's totally what I want to do with my Saturday. Realize that I'm treating the women in my life like objects and not people. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And the first step to that is where that sort of narrative competence piece comes in, to really engage with someone's story, especially if a woman is telling you a story of harm, and to hold space for that, to observe what she is actually asking you to do as opposed to what you think you should do, and then to puzzle out if that ask is aligned with your values or not. And if it's not, maybe start to question those values. It's hard, it's not easy work. And I would say, find a good therapist to get you through it, because it's also not work you should maybe do alone. But to really start to engage with the women in your life like they are human beings, and to hold space for that suffering, because there is a lot of it that they probably aren't telling you about. And not because they don't think you're competent or don't think you care about them. Women have also historically been socialized to protect people, to take good care of them, not to be like, I am suffering, help me. We do that with each other sometimes, but we often don't take that to people who we don't believe see us as humans. It's a difficult work to do, but I would say start to like really see women as human beings, not as objects, and as equals is the next step. Once you grant them humanity, then grant them equality. But yeah, that basic shared humanity, I think, is the root cause issue.
To my listeners, what do you think of my chat with Naya Bajaj? I'd love to hear from you. Just DM me on Blue Sky at thestumblingspirit.bsky.social. You say that your mission is to empower women at all stages to thrive by optimizing their well-being, presence, and influence. What do you mean by that?
I think for me, the core word there is the optimization, because we exist in systems and structures that are not set up for us to thrive. And life changes. Every day, there will be something different about what is happening. And so, my work really is to support women, female bodied people, to get to know themselves in a way that perhaps they haven't been encouraged to, which is, all of the, like, whether it's all 5 layers of their being or which, however deep they want to go. And then to make informed, values aligned choices about how they take care of themselves. And whether that's diet, sleep, nutrition, movement, or it is that values-based work. How am I making these choices in my life? What is my occupational well-being like? What is my financial well-being like? And what legacy do I want to leave? Because we exist in relationships. How do I want to be remembered by the people that I engage with, by my community, by the world, if that's the ambition? And to do that in a way that keeps them well, so that it doesn't come at the cost of well-being, because it is often very easy to pour yourself into something. As someone who serially burns out, I could say this, right? Pour yourself into something and then not have anything left for you. And so my work really is to support women with that awareness and the agency that comes with it, so they can make choices that keep them well and keep their communities well, because we exist in relationship.
Earlier, you mentioned menopause. So, how does your practice help women with menopause?
Oh man, this is a big question. So there's not a ton of research, even though menopause is sort of a given experience for half the human population. We don't have a lot of good science yet. We are starting to build a good evidence base for practice, but in the yogic tradition and in the Ayurvedic tradition, menopause, like puberty, it's not a disease condition. It's something that is going to happen in your lifetime. So the tools in the toolbox really are, based on your constitutional type. What are the symptoms that might arise given sort of how far you have moved from your initial constitution that are causing suffering? And then how do we relieve those and get you back to the person that you were. There is also sort of over the lifespan in Ayurvedic medicine, you sort of have periods that are dictated by certain elements, as it were. So, as a child, as muscles and bones are growing, it is, we think about it as sort of a very earth elemental phase because you make things out of mud, you make sustainable things out of mud. And so that is that phase. Midlife is very fire driven. We are often quite ambitious, often building. That heat generates a lot of things. If you think about, steam powered engines did a lot more than, this is my lack of scientific knowledge, the thing that came before steam powered engines, coal powered engines, I think it was. But to sort of harness that heat and use it to drive progress in whatever direction is meaningful. And the end of life stage is marked often sort of by air and space, which in traditional cultures, often you would sort of move into a more spiritual phase of life. You would dive deeper into those big philosophical ideas. But it's also a very dry period. If you think about air and space, those are not wet, moist conditions. And if you think about bodies as they age, they also get dry, right? Bones start making noises that they didn't used to make. Tissue dries up. Digestive systems change. And so to think about that elemental perspective as you move into this phase of life, which can also be quite drying, we know when estrogen levels drop, mucous membranes dry up. That contributes to all kinds of systemic level effects. So to think about those pieces from the Ayurvedic lens, to think about, I know this is true for many perimenopausal and menopausal women, we're suddenly very angry about very many things. And maybe it's an age related piece where there's room to express that anger because we have more access to physical capital, we have more access to power in spaces and places, and so we can express that anger. But to use that anger well. So instead of being super grumpy because your partner is chewing and you can hear it and it's driving you up the wall, maybe take that anger and redirect it to change a social system. To take that, very righteous anger and to use it for good, as opposed to direct it immediately at the people around you and damage those relationships. So there are many tools in the toolbox, depending on what the experience of suffering is and what people want to address. And I have some students who are like, nope, just want to address night sweats and hot flashes, don't care about the rest of it. That's fine. We have tools for that. But if you're like, what do I do with this anger? Because it's eating me on the inside and is damaging my relationships, we can have meaningful conversations about that as well. And the kind of legacy you want to leave for the people who will come after you.
I want to learn more about a couple of the services that you offer. You have something called the Burnout Blueprint. What is that?
I created that because I often have women come to me and they're like, I don't know if I'm burnt out or I'm perimenopausal, and no one can give me a good answer. So after sort of the hormone panel work is done, if it's not perimenopause, if you're not there yet, then it may be burnout. And post-pandemic, this is true for very, very many of us, particularly I want to say in the last couple of years, because employers, at least where I am, were super invested in everyone's well-being for a good 3 years, and then they just pulled all that funding back. So all of the things that people had access to in their workplaces are no longer available. But the amount of work has gone up. There are fewer people to do it, and it's all due yesterday. And that's driving some pretty terrible system level changes that are directly impacting people's cognitive health and their physical health as well. And so the Burnout Blueprint really is an invitation to pause and reflect on sort of what are the driving factors of someone's burnout experience. Because there is usually sort of the one symptom that tells you what it is, but there's all of the things that led up to that. So my last burnout experience, my primary indicator was a massive drop in energy. I used to be that person who, I'm up at 6:30, my feet hit the floor and I'm gone. There's no gentle awakening, none of those lovely things. It's like I like Energizer Bunny, go, go, go from 6:30 to midnight, no problem. No drop in energy, good cognitive focus. And there were days where I couldn't get out of bed and it wasn't because of pain. I didn't want to. I could not find the cognitive energy to do the things that I was going to do. I was not excited. I was pretty resentful and I could not do it. And I know this is in my burnout profile. So I went to my physician. I was like, we need a blood panel. And she was like, oh, you have no iron. You're tired because you literally your ferritin is at a 4. For most people, it's at least a 200. Yeah. So she's like, I don't know how you've been going for this long, but there's nothing left in the system. And so for me, my burnout profile is almost always nutritional first. And this comes from a lifetime of disordered eating, right? It doesn't come from nowhere. I know that about myself. And so for folks who are like, I don't know what is happening, we first start with the profile. And is it, physical? Is it purpose aligned? Because for some people, they're like, this just doesn't seem like there's any point to what I'm doing, but I keep doing it in hopes of finding some purpose. And so we do an analysis for that. Or is it systemic? Is it because you're putting in a 10-hour day at work, you come home and you have to do all of the childcare and keep the house running and manage these 5 other community things, and you just spread so thin that there is no resource there for you. And so once we know what the profile is, then we start to explore, what are the meaningful boundaries that you can put in place, and what are the practices that you need to take good care of you. In my case, it's where are the nutritional supports? Do I need to go back to seeing my personal trainer who can help me gauge whether or not I'm building enough muscle to have the energy to do the things that I want to do? But if it is purpose aligned, what are the things that give you purpose, and why are they no longer in your life, and how do we reclaim those? If it is a resource and a system level issue, where can we start to build those in? And maybe it's community supports, maybe it's family supports, maybe you need a paid care team to come in and handle some things. And so we start to puzzle those out. And all of those draw from the core 8 limbs of yoga, right? Maybe you need to visualize what that life is so that you can find your way there. Because if you've never thought about it, how are you going to get there? But maybe it is, when was the last time you thought about your values and how you make decisions? Or maybe it is the movement. So all of those things will be determined by the human and what the root cause of the suffering is. But we build a blueprint, and chances are if you burn out more than once, there are similarities over time. So we build it once, and then you can keep going back to it and evaluating and testing and playing with the system.
There's another blueprint that you help your clients with, and that is your way better
Yes.
blueprint. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So as someone who has struggled with weight for a long time, this is not a weight loss program. And I put that right up front. This is not a weight loss program. Do people lose weight on it? Yes, if that's their goal. But the Way Better Blueprint really is about examining your relationship to weight. And if you want to talk about diet culture, we can do that. But it is very much about examining what has shaped your relationship to your body, and then what tools do we need to put in place so you can feel safe and comfortable in it? Because we are told many, many things about weight from a lot of different sources. Not all of them are helpful. Most of them are wrong. And so it really is an examining, did you come to be where you're at? Does that align with your values? Does that align with who you want to be? If you want to be in a smaller body, is that going to serve you? And, if you're having knee surgery and your surgeon said, please lose X amount of weight so that your surgery will be successful, sure, that is a reasonable thing and we can work on that. But maybe there's some advocacy to be done around that as well. And so it is the opening of a more complex conversation. And then similarly, we use all of the tools from the 8 limbs to puzzle out how we move forward so that you can come to be in a body that feels safe and comfortable for you. So it's not a weight loss program. There's no promise that, you do this for 8 weeks and you'll lose X number of pounds and you'll be happy forever. But it is about coming to a place of comfort in your body.
You also offer a meditation mastery program. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. I built this for my students who would come to me and say, Naya, I cannot sit still for 30 minutes with my eyes closed and not think of anything, which I was like, I don't know why you keep thinking that's what you're supposed to be doing. And so these are very short practices. I think the longest one is a half-hour yoga nidra practice. So it's designed for folks who are struggling with sleep as a way to access rest if a nap doesn't feel accessible. And there are 12 practices across a range of different focus points. They're all guided. So it's not sit in silence with your own brain and try and silence your thoughts, because that's not, your mind is designed to think. That's what it's supposed to do. So we're not trying to dissuade it from its function, but each of those practices offers a focal point and a different goal. So there's a 7-minute practice for focus, which many of my burnout blueprint students will use as they reclaim their capacity for focus. There's also a slightly longer practice to manage that, creeping sense of anxiety that some of us experience, not generalized anxiety disorder, which obviously might require some pharmacological supports, but that, that the world is on fire. Some of us are anxious about it. And so to find a place to acknowledge that anxiety and then maybe make one choice that will relieve a little bit of that suffering. There is obviously the sleep practice. And so it is sort of a taster set of samples, as it were, into different types of meditation practices, all of them supported to start to build a sense of mastery. You will not be a meditation master by the end of it. That is not the promise, but it is to start to cultivate a sense of agency in the practice and a sense of accessibility. So to sort of master your apprehension about it, perhaps, and to build a sense of competence in this practice. And then once you find one you like, you can either keep doing it, you can ping me and ask for more, or you could go to a place like Insight Timer and look for something similar to continue to build your repository practice.
You talk about helping women build a sense of agency through the mastery of meditation. So, why don't we take that a little bit further? What is the overarching message that you have for women in terms of reclaiming their personal power?
That it is theirs to reclaim, because I would venture many women have either been told that it is not, or have internalized that message from somewhere, that they don't have capacity or ability to make decisions for themselves, that those should always be colored by other people need this, and whether other people are literally the hundreds of thousands of Ontarians that I'm serving as a public servant, or literally my parents who are in the next room who need me for all of these things. The invitation is to consider how much more full and realized life would be if you took good care of yourself first, because that will enable everything else that you want to do. It does not have to come at the cost of your well-being.
What does resilience mean to you?
I've been thinking about this because I spent a lot of time in the corporate wellness space over the last 3 to 5 years, and the conversation is always about bouncing back. I was like, okay, but I'm not a rubber ball. And bouncing is high impact. As someone whose joints don't work properly, is actually a little bit terrifying as an analogy. Like, I will just splat on the floor. There's no bounce in this body in that way. I've been thinking about it as an awareness of capacity and a choice to return. And for me, that choice is really important, because being resilient in systems that are designed to extract from you doesn't actually serve people well, in my opinion. And I know employers don't want to hear this from me, but I think the awareness of, this is where my capacity is, this is what the work is demanding from me. Do I want to keep coming back to this? Like, do I want to get to a place where I'm fully extracted from and then, do whatever it takes to replenish? Do I want to keep coming back to this extractive process, or do I want to find a different way to be with it? And I recognize, not everyone is going to go out and be an entrepreneur. Not everyone can afford to step away from, however it is they are making money, because life is expensive and getting more expensive every day. So I'm not suggesting you quit your job and move to the top of a mountain and meditate forever, though if that's your jam, please do that. But for those of us who are going to continue to exist in these systems because we don't have the option to opt out, how much are you putting into it? And what are you going to take back? Because if it's not serving you and it is entirely extractive, then decide how much you want to allow it to extract from you. Because there is agency in that. We are taught that there is not, but there is. And so for me, resilience is that awareness of, like, how much am I allowing? And then what am I doing to replenish?
I really like that idea, the idea of the awareness of our capacity and our choice to return to that extractive system. So let me ask you then, What are your practices of resilience?
I think for me, the sort of more tangible practices are on the awareness side. And it is that breath awareness, because that is my first indicator of suffering. It is also my relational awareness, because I know as I get closer and closer to burnout, and my colleagues know this about me too, my emails go from being really lovely and caring to being like 2 word responses. And I get very short and very sharp and very brusque. And that's not who I actually am. I am quite flowery. I am quite descriptive. But my colleagues know, like, if I haven't asked about their day in a week, there's a problem. And then they will also flag for me. So part of it is communicator as well, because sometimes we get really tunnel visioned about things we care about and we miss those markers, or we allow them to fall by the wayside because the thing is more important. And so my practices are both sort of those inward physiological, but also physical. Like my body will cause pain if it's not well cared for. And I'm really lucky to have a very loud alarm system in that way. So if I'm, skipping meals because of meetings, or I'm, staying up late to work on projects, I will know the next day. And then I get to make a choice of, do I take a morning off to recover, to rest, to nourish, or do I keep going and know that then I will have to take a whole week off? And is that, more feasible for this timeline? But that's a choice that I make. It's not a reactive, just keep going, hope someone else steps in and helps me out. Though I do have a team that will step in and help me out if it gets bad. And so it is that awareness, then it is the active decision making, which is a real time process, but also a thoughtful, paused process. So in real time, notice the breath, decide what I'm going to do about it. But also, once a week, actually pause, reflect, and decide, was that sustainable? Were those costs acceptable? Is this recovery time okay? Or are there other things that are more important and this is no longer acceptable and I'm going to make some changes and I'm going to communicate those changes to people? I'm not just going to stop showing up to meetings because it's no longer important, but there may be a request to be like, hey, people manager, this is too much. Can you either shift my timelines or delegate the work to someone else? Or can I delegate it to someone else? Because this is not sustainable. So leaning on those supports to prioritize as well. Or in my practice as a therapist, it's like, okay, maybe I cannot see 5 clients a week for this stretch of time. Maybe it is only 2. And then where else, do I need to move things around as an entrepreneur to ensure that this practice continues to thrive? Is there, non-time sensitive work I can take on that is less energetically demanding? But it is that deliberate, ongoing practice.
All season long, I've been exploring the connection between compassion and resilience. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on the interplay between those two concepts.
Yeah, I do. I do, both on sort of the self-compassion side and then also sort of the compassion that we direct outward. And I was lucky to train with the Compassion Institute, who helped reframe my thinking around empathy and compassion, because I find people interchange those words and pretend like they're the same thing and they're really not. And so, sort of what I took from their teachings was the empathetic practice is very much that like human level relating and understanding of suffering, but I don't have to own that suffering. It's not mine to own, unless I caused it, in which case that's a whole separate conversation. But that capacity to recognize, which is what comes in the narrative practice. Compassion is the informed action that comes from that empathy, in my understanding. And so I haven't always been good at sort of self empathy, as it were, because for a long time, my body was just something that I used to get through the world. It was the thing that carried my brain around. It didn't really matter what happened to it so long as my brain was going where it needed to go. And so self compassion has been a journey and continues to be a journey. But that sort of deliberate pause and noticing of values aligned action is something that I'm getting better at. I would say I do it far better for other humans. Maybe that's why, therapy is a reasonable place for me to be. But to also observe, as therapist, public servant, whatever hat I'm wearing, what is the action that I am being called to take? Both from the storyteller or, the human sitting in front of me who I can empathize with, because suffering at its root is the same regardless of cause and regardless of experience. But then how are we shifting the world to alleviate that suffering or prevent future suffering is that practice of compassion. And if we are not resilient, if we are not well resourced, if we are not taking good care of ourselves, it is much harder to take that action. The empathy piece, I think, is still quite possible, maybe because we are also suffering, and so it's easier to relate to people who are suffering. But if you are not well-resourced, taking that action, changing the world is very hard. And why would you choose to make it harder by not taking good care of yourself? Because that is in your control to a degree. And so to the degree that it is possible, take good care of you so then you can practice that compassion.
How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
I have a fairly uncommon name, so I'm very easy to Google, but that's not the way you want to go. You can find me at my website, which is holisticyogatherapy.ca. You can find me on Instagram at Holistic Yoga Therapist, or on LinkedIn. My name is also very easy to find. So my first name, Naya, Niya. My last name is Bajaj, so Bajaj.
Naya Bajaj is a certified holistic yoga therapist based in Toronto, Canada. Naya, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your insights on how women can reconnect back to themselves, reclaim their personal power through holistic yoga therapy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Blue Sky at thestumblingspirit.bsky.social. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.